Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is September the 25th, 2022, and we are here to talk about the world. History, current events, foreign policy, economics, and all of that stuff. Without further ado, I will jump in the chat with my friend. Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
Really good. How are you doing? Thank you for the patience with my food time, which I mistimed slightly.
Oh, it's fine. Just gives me more time to kind of look through notes and find things worth talking about. How's your week been?
Pretty fantastic. I'm on day 97 of my burpees challenge thing.
Still doing it.
Yep, still doing it. I was approaching day 100 and it's like, man, that would be really badass. Let's keep going. So I've just kept going like a maniac. But I have
More power to you.
a TwitchCon trip coming up, and then the next expansion of Classic WoW is coming out tomorrow. So I'll be basically no life in it on as little sleep as possible to get to max level with my brother and then 3 people from our guild. So that'll be really fun. And then the news has been a little bit more hype, I think, this week, at least from what I could tell. The biggest item so far, you may have heard us talking about it earlier, was Iran.
Oh, all right. Okay. Yeah, that's been one of the big stories.
Mm-hmm. And then they mentioned general elections in Italy. And there was a big thing that happened in China. Not sure what exactly went down, but people used the word coup, but it doesn't seem like there actually was one.
No. Well, there were some rumors on China's internet for a while. It's not all that unusual. You know, they conspiracy monger just as anybody else over there on their internet. Every so often, there's kind of a little minor panic.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, nothing of substance has happened anyway that I'm aware of.
But the
Nobody brought up
what?
Russia's mobilization.
Yes, that was another one of the, the items that people have talked about, specifically regarding protests in Moscow, and then apparently Putin moved to his palace in the woods or something.
I don't know about the latter one, but yeah.
Yeah, I saw a headline of that when I woke up this morning, that he left the Kremlin or whatever and went to his very luxurious estate in the woods, and they listed off all the different amenities and stuff that were there, which kind of pointed to more of that discontent with his very, very high level of power and wealth and so on in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
But they were pretty brutal with the crackdowns of protesters in the past, but it seems like people don't care. They're still going at it.
Which country?
Russia.
Still talking about Russia. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit more. You know, they've kind of ramped it up. You know, they tend to scale up repression with the scale of resistance or unrest, rather. So yeah, there's been more arrests. There's been more brutality, allegedly. So no surprises in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think overall it's more the legal changes that are probably more disconcerting for people, because they've kind of they're cracking down more on expressions of dissent, whereas before they more just focused on, you know, outward displays of dissent. So in that sense, the space for free expression and freedom of speech has narrowed considerably since the war began.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly in the past month or so, they've been accelerating that.
Yeah, and there was a referendum or something that they were trying to do in the territories that they took in Ukraine, but I'm not sure what the details of that are.
That's an interesting move. Those are referendums designed, well, the referendums on whether or not those territories will be annexed by Russia, whereupon they would become provinces of the Russian Federation. And you know, I mean, nobody's fooled by that. Everybody knows it's just sort of a fake referendum that doesn't really mean anything. But it's an interesting move because technically, if the referenda do go forward, And of course, the result is going to be yes, that, the referendum is going to have a predetermined outcome, which is going to be that the people will allegedly want to join with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So if that were to go forward, then the Russian Federation would be able to argue that it is defending itself in the war in Ukraine. They could say that the Ukrainian army, as backed by its Western enemies, is invading sovereign Russian territory, that being the annexed territories in the south and east of Ukraine. And that opens up new possibilities strategically and legally for Moscow. Before it wasn't even really a war, right? It was a special military operation, quote unquote. And so, legally speaking, Russian soldiers were not bound to fight like they would be if it were, legally speaking, a declared war, because restrictions on the ability of soldiers to exit their contracts are much more limited in a peacetime scenario than in wartime, just the way the laws are written, so I've read. And because they didn't declare war, there was a lot of soldiers that were just walking away from their contracts so they wouldn't have to fight in Ukraine.
Oh.
So one of the things they can do then is, if the territories are annexed, that they can say they're fighting a defensive war, whereupon it goes from special military operation to actual war, and then they can actually trigger a lot of those wartime measures that previously they had not sort of been able to trigger because they had not declared a war yet. I guess you could say they were able and just didn't want to. I mean, there's not really much rule of law at this point in Russia, certainly not at the top level. So whatever the government wants, it generally gets. But in this case, the government, I think, my impression is that they didn't want to have to mobilize or otherwise trigger those kinds of wartime rules and restrictions, whatnot, because they didn't want to upset people, because that stuff is very intrusive, obviously. So now that part of the benefit of doing the referenda then is that it kind of shifts the framing. It gives the government an opportunity to shift the framing of the war from being just a little sort of bush war, basically, on Russia's border that people don't need to pay any attention to because it's going to be over in a couple days. So, why worry about it? Obviously, that logic has failed subsequently. What is it? It's like 5 months now into the war. So if they can reframe it as an actual war, but a defensive one, not one that the government of Russia started, of course, peace lovers that they are, then they can kind of shift people's mentality to one of protecting their country instead of, fighting in just a mistake, basically, which is what it's become. So shifting the framing is important, changing the legality of it. Also, Russian military doctrine generally allows a much broader range of responses in the event of defending sovereign Russian territory than in, say, a foreign adventure. If the Russian military is just operating abroad and doing something, they're not supposed to use nuclear weapons, for example. Those are supposed to be exclusively for the defense of Russia. So up till now, Russia has, they've threatened that they might use nuclear weapons, but I don't think anybody's really, well, I should say nobody in the foreign policy community has really taken those threats very seriously, because it's sort of known that that would be extremely risky for Russia. Everybody talks about how the United States and the West needs to be very careful so that they don't escalate with Russia, but the same logic also applies to Moscow. They're also trying to be careful so that they don't escalate with the West and end up in a nuclear shooting war that they didn't want to be in. But that said, there is a question of whether the West would necessarily escalate if nuclear weapons were used by Russia just in Ukraine, and if they were just tactical nuclear weapons used on individual battlefields. So that has been somewhat of a more ambiguous question than whether or not Russia would just unload with nukes, or certainly whether or not they would attack the West with nukes. Nobody really thought that was likely or necessarily even possible, given restrictions. But by having the referendum and reframing the war as a war of defense, they can cite military doctrine as a kind of excuse to use nuclear weapons, which opens up that possibility. Now, whether or not they're actually thinking about using nuclear weapons, or whether they're just signaling that they might by shifting the framing in order to try to scare the West and scare the Ukrainian government, That's debatable. That's not really entirely clear right now. The United States government has been coming out the past couple days and has been saying in increasingly terse terms that there would be a severe reaction from the West if the Russian government did use nuclear weapons, which is a little unnerving because
Hmm.
normally we don't respond that much to sort of these kinds of threats. You know, you can think of North Korea constantly threatening to, blow up the moon or whatever if they don't get what they want, and of course people just kind of ignore it. So if the U.S. government is taking it seriously enough to at least post a response, that suggests that maybe the threats are more substantive this time. But it could also be that Washington just wants to cover all of their bases, so to speak. They don't want to leave any uncertainty in Moscow as to what the Western response would be if there were nuclear escalation in Ukraine. They want to be clear about that beforehand, because afterwards it's going to be too late, and the risk of escalation is much higher then. So basically, maybe nuclear war, but maybe not. Not entirely clear where we're going at this point, but clearly it's an escalation.
Hmm.
This is some kind of maneuver on the part of Moscow to set the stage for something. Possibly nuclear escalation, maybe just conventional escalation, or maybe not even either of those. Maybe just a kind of political maneuver to try to get people in Russia excited.
Yeah, well, one of the things that we talked about really early on was the moral high ground and how, by Ukraine being the defenders of their established sovereign state, they had the moral high ground really easily. Like it wasn't really something that countries around the world that were debating. The only ones who really sided with Russia were countries that really just disliked the countries that were supporting Ukraine. So it's kind of their way to take the opposing stance, but and yet you can see if they're driving into a neighboring country and taking over, that's like the bad thing to do.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
with this referendum, they can make it look more like, well, see, like the people actually wanted to have Russia be leading them and that kind of thing, because we're gonna do it better and liberate them and stuff. And we've seen some of that language used with U.S. intervention in places of no, we're civilizing them, we're giving them all these tools, stuff like that, where you make yourself out to be the good guy. So it seems like by hosting a referendum, they sort of do some posturing that this is a democratic takeover and not a military takeover. And it's, yeah, pretty tough to verify that like this vote would be legit and that people would actually want this, as opposed to, well, we can just like stack the vote to whatever we want the outcome to be, and then we're going to look like the rescuers rather than the interlopers.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't think that is going to work so well. I mean, there's already a lot of unrest in the occupied territories, and a lot of the electoral infrastructure that's been set up for the referendum has been targeted by saboteurs, and some of the election officials have been targeted for assassination by partisans.
Mm.
So, not really ideal circumstances in which to hold a referendum, to put it mildly. They've been talking about holding a referendum for months, almost from the beginning of the war, but they had to delay it interminably, because conditions on the ground were not really fit for it, and because the military situation was sort of in flux. But it seems they've decided to push things forward regardless of those two variables. So yeah, we'll see where they go with it. But it's not something that's going to be that predictable at this juncture, I think. It's just kind of a wait and see situation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was more interested in the announcement of a mobilization. That's another thing they've been kind of flirting with since the start of the war. Some people were saying they should have done it much earlier, but then, of course, that would have been something of a strain for Russia's administrative state, which is obviously pretty rickety. The war in Ukraine has kind of revealed that in terms of the military, but I don't doubt that other parts of the Russian government are similarly decrepit by this point. One of the reasons that I read a long time ago, earlier in the conflict, about why Russia would not mobilize is because it would be very expensive and that it would take a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
Russia was obviously going for a quick knockout victory at the start, so it didn't really make sense then to really push hard in terms of mobilization and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So in the subsequent few months, it's become apparent that the war will be a long one. So it makes more sense at this juncture to mobilize than it did before. But even so, regardless of the time frame, it's going to take a while. Like what I was reading is that full mobilization would take something like 6 months to a year for Russia.
Hmm.
And that just has to do with the amount of administrative resources it would take, the amount of weapons and material that would have to be secured and supplied in order to ensure everybody had the necessary weapons and equipment. And also, a lot of logistics would be involved in mobilizing those people, moving them from location to location, getting them prepared, and then moving them to the front. So, full mobilization would actually be very difficult. And it would leave lots of time for preparation on the part of Ukraine and on the part of the West.
Hmm.
So, that's part of the reason why the mobilization was only partial. I don't know if you'd heard that, but it's only a partial mobilization at the moment. So thus far, they're only mobilizing reservists, and specifically reservists with military experience. That's more what they're going for. So they're trying to pick out those people that are available. And allegedly, they're trying to recruit 300,000 men in order as part of the partial mobilization. But there's a rumor that they're actually going to recruit 4 times that number, something more on the order of 1.2 million men.
Hmm.
That's unconfirmed, but it's possible. The Russian government may prefer. I mean, obviously, the army would prefer more to less, but the more people they mobilize, then the more of an issue it's going to be politically, because mobilization, I don't gather, is all that popular amongst the Russian population, given some of the response that's happened since the announcement of the mobilization. Have you seen any of that?
I saw that there were protests and stuff, but I didn't quite see the general public consensus on what they feel about the mobilization.
Well, that's difficult to ascertain, and, just because people are not entirely honest about polling, but looking at the borders of Russia along countries that it is not in the process of invading anyway, they're quite crowded at the moment. There's something of a minor exodus.
Mm.
A whole multitude of people are trying to get out of Russia. Tickets for planes out of Russia basically just sold out in the aftermath of the announcement.
Yeah, I did see that.
And there's long lines of people on the borders, in their cars on the roads, specifically in the Caucasus, I think. That's the main one. Lots of people trying to drive into Georgia, if not also Azerbaijan.
Hmm.
So, yeah, it seems that a big part of the response has been a lot of people just trying to jump ship. A lot of people who think that they're afraid of who think they're in danger of being drafted, trying to get out of the country before they can be served papers.
Yeah, I did see there was someone in Mongolia. I'm not sure if it was the president or prime minister or whoever, but they were saying that they welcome people. I think they were specifically referring to some ethnic groups that are more so on the Siberian side of Russia that have overlap culturally and ethnically with native Mongolian people and stuff. And they were saying that they would accept them into the country because I think they're in that group of people who would be drafted based on age range and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like men in
Yeah.
their 20s and 30s that they're mainly grabbing.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, younger.
Yeah.
Supposedly. Whether just what exactly they're doing is actually the subject of some debate. But you're right about Mongolia. I saw that story too. It was actually the former president of Mongolia. He came out and announced that he was very critical of the war and that the borders of Mongolia should be opened to ethnic Buryats in the Russian oblast of Buryatia, so that those who were dissidents, or at least those who did not want to go and fight in a war, would not have to. And from what I've read, the Mongolian government has been relatively receptive to that notion. It's a little bit awkward. Mongolia is not really in a position to piss off its neighbors too much. It only has two, but both of them are much, much bigger than it, that being China and Russia. But, kind of like Kazakhstan, the government there has been pretty critical of the conflict in Ukraine overall. And they've been weirdly receptive to policy proposals that have been favorable to those trying to get out of Russia in order to avoid any kind of draft. Yeah, that's another thing that's worth mentioning about the draft. Supposedly, and it's kind of anecdotal evidence for the moment, but supposedly the recruitment is being focused in provinces where ethnic minorities predominate. It kind of seems like the government is trying to minimize the burden on the actual ethnic Russian population, and especially on the population in major urban centers. Those are the areas, from what I've read anyway, that the government is most concerned, where the government is most concerned about potential backlash in terms of protests, unrest, and what have you. So if that's accurate, then that means that the burden of the draft and also, by extension, the war effort is going to be falling on groups that make up only a very small portion of the overall population, but relatively large portions of the oblasts in which they live, that being the provinces in which they live. Buryatia is, or Buryatia, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, is one of those that's come up a lot in conversations online. Ethnic Buryats make up a disproportionately large chunk of the Russian army's infantry in Ukraine, if not in general. Nowhere near a majority. I'm not saying like they're half or something like that, but they make up only a couple of percentage points of the overall population. But they're more like 5 to 10% of the military. So it's pretty clear that they're disproportionately recruiting from those populations. It's not just because they're ethnic minorities, it's also because they're relatively poor. That makes them more receptive to offers of recruitment, especially offers that involve some kind of signing bonus or higher salary, which is something else that they've been doing. And there's also been reports that military recruiters have not been adhering to the government's requests, specifically the request for personnel, reservists that have previous military experience. It seems more like they've been given a quota and are just sort of recruiting anybody that they think will allow them to meet quota, whether they qualify according to the qualifications outlined by Moscow or not. And so that's resulted in a lot of people who don't have military experience, and in some cases, people who are not even reservists being served papers to report it to be incorporated into the Russian army. So that's resulted in a lot of angst on the Russian internet in particular, and that's only fed concerns that the government is lying about the extent of the draft and that they're actually going to draft a much broader range of people than they had initially indicated. And so that's part of the reason there's been such an exodus out of Russia after the fact. You know, the government is not doing itself any favors in terms of assuaging fears that this is a full or near full mobilization in secret, as opposed to the superficial partial mobilization that they've publicly announced. So until the government is consistent in its recruiting efforts, there will probably be ongoing concerns to that effect.
Yeah, one of the things that I saw as like a main selling point of Putin's power in Russia was his ability to control information and to lead people in directions with propaganda. And that seems like one of the things that's a running theme for them, is they're using how they talk to their people, how they talk about the conflict, and they're being very careful about word choice and stuff to make that look like they're in the right and they should be doing this. And then with the pulling minority groups and people who are like further away from the cities, that's like a lower risk to them of upsetting the majority groups in Russia overall, but you still have bodies to throw at the problem, basically.
Yeah.
So pretty messed up, but you can kind of see the reasoning behind those moves. Yeah, I put up the map of Buryatia on the stream for a sec so people could see where that was. I wasn't sure where it was, but it's like south and east in Russia, like really far east.
Yeah, far eastern Russia.
And the people in the images look to have a lot of similarity in appearance and garb with Mongolians, so that makes sense. It's not.
Yeah, they're not alone in that regard.
Yeah.
There's a couple of oblasts over there that are similar in ethnic makeup. I'm not sure why Buryatia seems to come up so much in online conversations, but yeah, that's not alone in being an ethnic minority state over there. But yeah, that's pretty much how it works in authoritarian political systems. You can't ignore the public entirely, but you can try to put the burden on the burden of unpopular policies on groups that are relatively weaker and less likely to cause you problems. So that's always a decent strategy up until it blows up in your face anyway. It's always a risk that the people that you select for the special privilege of taking on that undue burden don't particularly appreciate it and decide to fight back, and then you have bigger problems than what you started with. But for the
Yeah,
moment,
another
go
factor
ahead.
too is the morale of like if you're pulling people who are really far away from Ukraine, it can feel like less of an issue that they feel motivated to fight hard for.
Mhm.
And that's something that I don't think there's a way for Russia to actually win in the moral factor department because of the nature of why they're invading. Hard to motivate the people to be really gung ho about going to war for something they didn't really ask for.
Yeah. But yeah, that's the partial mobilization. Let me see if I can. Oh, yeah, they announced an exemption for IT workers, bankers, and journalists working for state media specifically. So those are sensitive groups, not just in terms of not wanting to piss them off, but retain them. Those are important figures within the Russian political economy.
Mm-hmm.
So keeping them from leaving and making sure that they're at least content is going to be an important objective. So regardless of how mismanaged the recruitment effort is in the partial mobilization, those groups will be a protected class. And it kind of shows you where their priorities are. IT workers are an important part of the tech economy, which is a much more resilient sector. We saw that in the United States with COVID-19. Like most sectors of the economy were pretty significantly disrupted by the pandemic because, workers couldn't go to factories, restaurant workers couldn't go to restaurants or what have you. But the tech sector is unique in that it can be done mostly online, at least in many cases. And so as a result, the IT sector, such as the tech sector, such as it is, uh, did not suffer nearly as much from the pandemic as other sectors. In fact, it probably grew in a lot of aspects, in specific sub-industries. And as a result, they were able to kind of carry the economy through the pandemic, at least in the United States. We have an unusually large tech sector here, so it was kind of strong enough to do that. But even in countries where the tech sector is smaller, it can be an important source of foreign revenue, or I should say foreign currency. Because while we don't really think of services as necessarily being an export per se, it is, or at least when they're, actually dealing with foreign clients. So, if you're a client in like Europe or North America or Japan or wherever, you may contract with another firm to do some kind of back office tech stuff for you. And it may be that they contract out some of that work to some kind of company in Russia or maybe just Eastern Europe generally, because the labor is a little cheaper there, but the human capital is relatively high.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because that industry generates foreign currency, the Russian government is particularly interested in trying to protect it. It's a kind of a double-edged sword, though, because while it is very resilient and can generate a lot of foreign currency for you, it's also flighty. There's not really any particular reason the tech sector necessarily needs to be geographically concentrated in any particular area. So if you piss them off too much, they can just leave and they can do their work from, wherever else they want to go to,
Mm-hmm.
whereupon you kind of lose that revenue. So that's why Moscow is trying to protect that particular group. They also want to protect bankers because obviously finance in Russia is undergoing some difficulties on account of all the sanctions. And so they want to make sure that the financial sector retains its talent and is able to maintain its integrity in the face of all the financial pressure that's being brought on it.
Mm-hmm.
And then journalists working for state media, that kind of speaks for itself. It's an authoritarian political economy, so they need mouthpieces. They need people who can influence the population. So, of course, you want them to stay where they are, especially when you're fighting a dumbass war that's going very badly for you. If ever an authoritarian government needs propaganda, it's in that particular circumstance. So no surprise they're protecting them as well.
That makes sense. Protect the news people, for they help you control the perception of the public.
And a couple other items here on the mobilization. There was a decree signed yesterday, actually. Yeah, yesterday was Saturday. So one of the things that the Ukrainian government has been doing, because it knows that a lot of Russian soldiers don't really want to be there and that it's a grind and that its morale is relatively low, they've been trying to push really hard to tell them and push the message that if they surrender, they'll be treated well, they'll get a payment. I think they actually did promise to pay them to surrender, so there's an actual reward for it. So they're pushing pretty hard to try to incentivize surrender. And so the Russian government, of course, is about to send at least 300,000 or so troops into Ukraine with minimal training. And in some cases, maybe even most cases, those people are not going to really want to be there. So those people in particular will probably be much more tempted by that message and offer from the Ukrainian government. So in response to that, yesterday the Russian government implemented some new rules, specifically punishment of up to 10 years for any soldier caught either surrendering, attempting to desert the military, or refusing to fight. And then there was also some new orders granting citizenship to any foreign national who signed up to serve a year in the country's military. And apparently that bypasses the usual requirement of 5 years residency as a prerequisite to applying for citizenship. So you can see here the Russian government really seems to be hurting for manpower. They're really trying hard to disincentivize even further people already in the military from leaving, and then they're creating new incentives for people from outside the country to try and come and fight with them.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the consistent things I've read about the Russian army since the war started is that they're suffering shortages of manpower. And that's probably only grown more acute the further it's gone along. There's not a lot of takers, I think, for fighting in what is turning into a particularly grinding, brutal conflict. Like, it's really surreal, if not eerie, just how closely this parallels World War I. In the sense, not exactly in terms of the background, but just in the sense that everybody expected the war to move very fast and expected all of the new technology that's been introduced into warfare over the past couple decades to inherently lend itself to relatively quick resolution of conflicts. And now we have this conflict that is turned into, borderline trench warfare in a lot of areas of the front.
Mm-hmm.
And progress is generally pretty slow on either side in their big pushes. Recent Kharkiv offensive notwithstanding. So a very interesting historical parallel there. But because the fighting is so grinding, it just makes it even less attractive than it already was. So no surprise then that Moscow is really having to dig hard to try to find replacements and has had to resort to this newest mobilization. Let's see, and you already mentioned all the protests. Obviously the protests were biggest in the immediate aftermath of the announcement.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. And let's see. Oh yeah, and you already mentioned the Mongolian thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's all I had on the partial mobilization. It remains to be seen whether 300,000 or even 1.2 million reservists being called up is going to be enough. From what I read, they're only going to get 2 weeks training.
2 weeks training?
2 weeks training before they get thrown in, which is not enough. It's not as bad as it sounds, because again, technically anyway, they're supposed to be recruiting reservists who already have military experience. So hypothetically, if that's true, then most of the people that they're drafting here should be people who have already been trained. So in that case, they don't necessarily need more training, they just more need like a refresher. So 2 weeks is not that bad for them, but in some cases, those people may have minimal military training, or if some of the rumors about a more expansive draft are true, maybe no military training. So for those people, 2 weeks is not enough, and they're basically just going to be cannon fodder, most likely. Either they'll be cannon fodder, or they're going to be used to replace troops with actual experience in rear echelon duties. That could work, but the Russian military is not that bottom heavy. That is to say, it's the tooth to tail ratio is mostly tooth, or at least relatively more is tooth.
What does
So I
that
don't know
mean?
how.
Tooth to tail ratio?
Well, it's like a rough description of the ratio between people who are actually fighting, infantry or, maybe pilots, people who actually are directly involved in combat, as opposed to the people who are just support personnel, people doing logistics, command personnel, staff, those kinds of background people. The business equivalent, I think, is back-end personnel,
Mm-hmm.
basically. Maybe that's not the best analogy, but you get the idea. Fighters versus supporters,
Yeah.
effectively. So in
DPS
Russia,
versus heals, if you want to use like a video game reference.
there you go. So I don't know how many rear echelon people there really is to replace in that sense. I don't imagine it's going to be enough to necessarily fill out, well, 300,000 incoming personnel. So I think more likely they're just going to end up getting thrown into quiet areas of the front, and then people with more experience will be moved from the quiet areas of the front and put into more active areas. That's my best guess as to what they'll actually end up doing. But that's not necessarily going to work either because we already saw what happened with the Kharkiv offensive recently. That was a quiet area of the front, and so that just left it, well, it left the defenses in that area very brittle, such that the Ukrainian army was able to kind of steamroll them. So that is to say, the introduction of these new troops could just mean that new areas of the front are going to be made even more brittle than they already are.
Mm-hmm.
Some areas may be reinforced and will be stronger. Probably Kherson would be my guess, since that's where the Ukrainians have been pushing more recently. But I don't know if it'll do them much good. If they get cut off from the east, then it's not going to matter much if they hold Kherson.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it is true that Russia does have something of a manpower advantage in this regard, but it's also worth remembering two things. One, the Ukrainians have a big advantage in terms of having started their mobilization at the beginning of the conflict. Like they didn't waste any time. Once it started, they were all in. So their mobilization is much more mature, so to speak. It's in a much more advanced stage. And like I mentioned before, it takes a long time, which is my second point. Like, even though they're going to, that is to say, Moscow is going to mobilize a lot of people, it's going to be months before they get anywhere near like a majority of people dumped into the front. Now, they can't accelerate that schedule, but that means that the troops they're mobilizing are going to be even less prepared than they would have been otherwise. And it was already clear that they were not going to be particularly prepared anyway. So just dumping, 300,000 unprepared dudes, or 1.2 million as the case may be, into a grinding conflict like this, where the rate of attrition is already relatively high for both sides, it's probably not going to go well. Like, especially given that the Ukrainians are getting lots of intelligence from the West. Like the CIA and other agencies are probably going to tell them where the new guys are being sent, and they will be targets, like very explicitly. Like those are soft targets, and you
How
can make
how are they telling them where they're being sent, like satellite and stuff?
God knows. I mean, CIA, NSA, like the whole menagerie of intelligence agencies in the United States. I think we've got over a dozen. And that's
Mm-hmm.
to say nothing of all the intelligence agencies in allied countries, like France, Germany, UK, etc. All of them are pretty good at signals intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of saw, even before the conflict started, that we have intelligence on their intentions.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some kind of intelligence somewhere in their communications network, maybe human intelligence. I don't want to downplay it entirely, but that's kind of a weak spot for the West historically. It's probably some kind of electronic surveillance. But regardless, we have intelligence on their military, their politics. Like, it's pretty clear we have some significant insight there. And from the start of the conflict, the United States and its allies have been sharing that insight and that intelligence with the Ukrainian military. So I don't have any doubt that the Ukrainian army is going to know where the rawest recruits are going to be
Mm-hmm.
deployed. And, you can make gains out of that. Territorial gains, or if nothing else, you can just soften them up. Get,
Chat says you can probably track conscripts on the normal social media platforms. Oof.
that's also true.
Yeah.
Actually, that's what happened back in 2014. It's one of the reasons that we know it was actually the Russian army and not little green men, as the
Yeah.
Moscow described them. Everybody and their mother was on Russian social media. I think it's V Contact and was posting like pictures and selfies, like, all that kind of thing that the kids do. So that made it pretty easy for casual observers outside to say, ah, yeah, that's pretty glaring evidence that it's actually the Russian army.
That's another kind of training, which it doesn't translate into like direct fighting combat skill, but it's like the overall operational security of teaching people what not to say and where not to post. Because there's that like the TikTok brigade. I don't know what the exact term for it is, but people who are like making all these different social media posts in active combat, which is just a massive security risk. You're demonstrating like this is where I am, this is the type of equipment we have. Like you're giving the opponent tons of free information by doing that. But they're like, yeah, it's so cool to be out here. Blah. I'm getting attention. I'm doing something that's badass. But if you were a really strict, focused military unit that had clear objectives, you would not just dump random information about your strat.
Yeah. Yeah, they have tightened up security on that in that regard more recently in the past few months. As the conflict has gone along, the Russian army has tried to police that more, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure that there's limitations even now, given the shortfalls in equipment and oversight and officers and all manner of necessities that would be necessary to make the Russian army more professional and better prepared than it has been.
Mm-hmm. We'll see what happens there. I did get an update from Bitter Sugar. So the area that his family had their kind of house in on the eastern side of the country,
Mhm.
it was retaken by Ukraine. So they have a
Ah,
location back, but they're not allowed to like just move back in there yet because it's like still being shelled sometimes and the area is mined up. So they
yeah.
have to be really careful. It's going to take some time to like demine the area and that kind of thing.
Yeah, probably for the best to stay away for now.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a fair number of mines. There's sometimes Ukrainian soldiers who post social media videos of them engaging in demining, sometimes in a very dangerous fashion. I think one of them was hitting a mine with a stick, trying to set it off. In his defense, it was a particular type of mine in which that was actually relatively safe, in so much as exploding mines can ever be safe.
If Russia can barely hold its own versus Ukraine, how could it ever stand up against NATO? Well, that also plays into the propaganda as being one of the strongest points of Russian leadership over the past few decades, is their ability to direct the informational flow in a way that makes them look like they've been keeping pace as a global superpower, but for what we would define as a superpower, they fall short in so many categories for just like basic military discipline, quality of troops, um, strategery, like the movements that they make and how smart those are.
Mhm.
One thing that makes a really good military is preparation for certain things to go wrong and having contingency plans for that. Like the arrogance of this whole conflict is one of the Achilles heels of why it's failed so hard is they expected it to be like the Iraq war thunder runs where they just roll through, win in a couple days, and then they can kind of do whatever they want. And then the real question is, what is the aftermath? How do you administrate? But in this case, they had that same expectation of we're just going to roll over. They're going to either celebrate us or the people who stand up to us are just going to lose really fast and it's going to be fine. But in this case, they ended up revealing a lot of the longer term systematic issues with their military industrial complex. So yeah, the notion that they were a superpower was definitely overblown. Yes, they have nuclear weapons. How many of them they have that are in good condition to actively use, we don't really know. But that's definitely something that any country carrying nukes, they have that advantage over countries that don't have nukes. But yeah, the classification of a superpower is pretty heavily contested now, given their failures in Ukraine.
Well, they really haven't been a superpower since the Cold War ended. And
Mm-hmm.
even during the Cold War, some people criticized the Soviet Union, as being much weaker than it presented itself as, or as the West presented it as.
Mm-hmm.
So, even then there were some doubts about superpowerdom. But certainly since then, it hasn't been. It's been a regional power.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely has some presence overseas, but that presence is relatively limited. Wagner Group ops in Africa and intervention in Syria are not really heavy lifts.
Yeah.
Syria in particular is not all that far away from Russia,
Mm-hmm.
and their involvement was pretty limited. It was mostly air support, which is easier than deploying whole brigades overseas and supplying them. It's a much easier lift for Russian logistics.
Agent Smith making airplane puns. I'm guessing you did that one by accident, but well played.
I guess so.
Some jokes just make themselves happen.
Yeah, Russia just hasn't had the economic base to really be much more than a regional power.
Mm-hmm.
It's leaned really heavily on energy in order to exert influence, and then it's leaned really hard on nuclear weapons in order to deter aggression.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true even now. Like, the only thing really holding back NATO from intervening in any way, besides, the fact that it would be politically contentious at home, is Russian nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a tool that they use in order to try to shield themselves, but it's a tool that they're overly dependent on.
Mm-hmm.
They've tried to modernize their military, but, we've kind of seen at this point how well that went. Not particularly well. So nuclear weapons are kind of their last resort, but also almost their first resort, just because they don't have much else they can depend on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of a problem, right? You want to be able to have a range of options to respond to aggression. If the only option that you have available to deter aggression is the one that blows up the planet, that's a problem.
Yeah. Because
That's,
you're also on the planet.
yeah, you're also on the planet, but also aggression tends to come in many shades. And so you tend to prefer to respond to aggression proportionately.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can't do that, like if your only option is, if your only options are either to do nothing or blow up the planet, then you're put in just a really difficult position strategically. This was a quandary that the United States faced in the Cold War, like very early on in the Cold War. Our strategy was just nuke people. Like if Soviet Union invades Western Europe, just nuke them. Just throw nukes at them, all of the nukes. No big deal. Who cares? That's just easy. But over time, it became apparent that a Soviet invasion was not the only contingency we needed to plan for. Like, what if the Red Army rolls into, say, West Berlin, but then nothing else? They just take West Berlin. What do you do? Like, what's the move for that? You're going to blow up the world for that? That's kind of stupid, right?
Yeah.
That's not proportional. So you need to maintain a relatively large standing military. I'm speaking in terms of the Cold War anyway. At the time, they determined that they needed to maintain a relatively large standing military. So in the event of a minor crisis, such as the one I just outlined, they would have options to respond. Like they could send a convoy, well, not a convoy per se, but they could send like an armored division through East Germany to West Berlin. And then they could use that to try to, free West Berlin or to pressure them or something. Mind you, they wouldn't have had to necessarily fight through East Germany. There was an agreement by which Western forces could actually travel by road to West Berlin. There was a number of weird agreements like that left over from the end of World War II, back when Germany was broken up into occupation zones. That actually did happen at one point, by the way. There was actually a Berlin crisis in, I want to say, 1960, thereabouts. I think it was before the Cuban Missile Crisis. And basically, it involved the Soviets restricting Western convoys from traveling by road to West Berlin. And so the Western response was to send an actual unit of soldiers, like U.S. Army soldiers. A contingent was sent from along that route, and they drove, against basically Soviet permission to West Berlin. And it was quite tense from what I read about it. I can actually tell you the book. I read about it in a book by David Hackworth, who at one point was the most decorated soldier in the history of the U.S. Army, or at least one of them. I don't know if he still is, but at the time he published his book in the 1980s, I think he had been. And he just wrote his book about his career in the Army from when he joined the U.S. Army in World War II when he was like 14, 15. He was way underage when he joined. He lied about his age to get in. And then he was just in the Army for like 30 years after that. You know, World War II, the Korean War, and then Vietnam. And so his book is really interesting. I would highly recommend it if you're interested in military history, because it kind of outlines the history of not only U.S. wars in the early Cold War, again, sort of Korea through Vietnam, but also he kind of talks about the institutional evolution of the U.S. Army and how it kind of moved from sort of more of a, I mean, it was always relatively professional, but it was not necessarily rationally managed per se, in the same way that businesses had come to become managed in sort of a more scientific manner. So one of the upgrades that they did, one of the big reform efforts after World War II was to try to rationalize the management within the U.S. Army. So it was really interesting how the Army kind of struggled with that and all of the problems that it caused, and some of which have not really been resolved up until even today. But anyway, David Hackworth, he talked about this crisis because he was actually there when it happened. He was stationed in Europe at the time. And his unit was, I think it was the 101st, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember exactly, but I think that's what it was. But his unit was deployed, and it was actually the unit that was tasked with driving to Berlin. And he described how all along the route there were Soviet units stationed along the road, on the side, just pointing their weapons at them. It was very, very tense. I think the most memorable story that he told from that event was the inspection, because part of the agreement by which convoys could travel to and fro from West Germany to West Berlin involved Soviet inspections. So, they could kind of stop your convoy and just look to see what was in your trucks and stuff to make sure there wasn't anything that wasn't supposed to be there. Now, one of the rules was that they were not allowed to actually touch the trucks. They were supposed to have U.S. personnel sort of open the doors or open the flaps at the back of the trucks or whatever it was. And this one inspector during this, crisis actually touched the truck. And the truck at the time was full of U.S. infantry. And one of the infantrymen, when the Soviet inspector touched the truck, just leaned out and kicked him in the face and knocked him over. And everybody held their breath because everybody was thinking, "Oh shit, World War III, this is it." And as it happened, the Soviet supervisor, came up to the guy who got kicked and yelled at him and told him basically, you weren't supposed to touch the fucking truck. And this is a big deal. This is a very tense moment. We need you to follow all of the rules and not blow up the world, please. Mm-hmm. So they managed to avoid escalation at that point. But yeah, that particular contingency that I described, a potential move where you have to move forces, conventional forces, through West Germany, or through East Germany rather, to get to East Berlin. That actually did happen. But that's an example of why you need options beyond just nuclear weapons. Because if you hadn't had those conventional forces ready, like, what would you do? Again, we weren't going to just nuke the Soviet Union to get back West Berlin. So that was the problem that we faced, and that's the problem that Russia faces now. Like, their army is just not up to snuff. It hasn't been in a long time. And so nuclear weapons are what they've been leaning on, strategically speaking, in order to deter aggression. Not only strategic nuclear weapons, but also tactical nuclear weapons. And so that's why there's particular concern and focus on tactical nuclear weapons. When people online, analysts and whatnot, talk about a potential for Russia using nuclear weapons, they're not talking about the potential for Moscow to use strategic nuclear weapons against the West or even Ukraine. Much more likely is that they'll use tactical nuclear weapons to blow up Ukrainian units in the field. And those are,
tactical
if you don't know
nukes are smaller.
Yeah, small yield nuclear weapons, like maybe 1 kiloton or half a kiloton, something kind of more in that range. Mm-hmm. It would still be a big escalation.
One of the analogies that's coming to mind for me here is basically, if you're relying on big nukes as a way of deterrence, when you get into a situation where you need to apply a small amount of force to protect yourself, you're going to be potentially hurting yourself. So, say for example, you're at home and you've got a mosquito in the house, and you reach for the flamethrower because that's all you have. You have no fly swatter or anything. And if you're going at the mosquito with a flamethrower in your house, like, obviously that's going to present some problems. So it behooves a country to not just have the capacity for dealing like a heavy strike somewhere, but like having a moderate way to apply pressure or put a presence somewhere that isn't annihilation of the area completely.
Exactly. You know, if you want another analogy, it's kind of like buying a gun without knowing how to fight.
Yeah.
Because if you don't know how to fight, then you're much more likely in a confrontation to pull out your weapon.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be that that's necessary to defend your life, but it may also be not necessarily. You know, maybe you're just in danger of, getting beaten or maybe just otherwise mildly injured. And so in a case like that, maybe it would be better, not to kill the other person
Mm-hmm.
or to at least escalate to that point. But, if you're not knowledgeable about fighting, on a one-on-one basis, you may not have, or at least you may not feel that you have much choice. And in that case, you're just going to default to the one option you have.
Mm-hmm.
So having options in terms of responding to individual aggression, you can also use that analogy here. You want to be able to respond to different confrontations with different responses. You don't want to immediately pull out your gun every time you get into a mild altercation.
That guy just called you an idiot. What do you do? Do you pull out your firearm or respond back verbally?
Yeah. You need something in your kit beyond the firearm.
Yeah.
So it's just about mitigating risk. You don't want to escalate to the point where you get there, so you need options. And so that's, again, just a way of managing risk. Not sure how we got onto that, but
We were
hopefully I
talking
made
about
some kind of point.
Yeah, we were talking about Russia not being a superpower because they've
Oh, yeah.
had nukes, but they haven't really had a really solid grasp of the medium to small scale of like effective military operations.
That's what it was. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's because they're not a superpower anymore, they don't have those other options. They're disproportionately dependent on nuclear weapons in the fashion that I described. So that adds to the risk here.
Mm-hmm.
But it also is indicative of how far they've fallen, in terms of their ability to project force. They just don't have that so much anymore. I had other stuff on Ukraine, but I don't know if you want to skip to that or if you don't want to skip to something else here before we get to it.
Yeah, we can do that. It's in the neighborhood.
Let's see. So, in terms of European solidarity on the Ukraine issue, one of the issues recently was Bulgaria. Their government had been relatively pro-Ukrainian and had been pushing hard to integrate, Bulgaria's natural gas network with Greece's so that they could take advantage of an LNG terminal that the Greeks have finished building recently. And that was looking like it would happen, but then recently there was a change of government in Bulgaria. And they've been much less gung-ho on that process, to the point where they've actually negotiated with Moscow as to restoring the flow of natural gas. And that's pretty controversial, as you might imagine. It's not too big a deal. I mean, Bulgaria is a pretty small country. They don't consume a whole lot of natural gas anyway. So it's not like the Russians are going to see a major influx of natural gas money out of that if they do end up resuming imports of Russian natural gas. But that said, it does illustrate that solidarity is not entirely 100% here.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people that don't particularly care about the Ukraine conflict. And even among those that do, there's a sense that they need more time to prepare for a world, well, that is to say, a Europe without Russian natural gas. And that's resulted in no small amount of foot dragging in some quarters as far as adapting to a new economic environment when they're having to source natural gas from other areas, or at least getting electricity from other electricity generating uh, buildings, plants, if you like, than natural gas plants. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on. Bulgaria is not too big a loss there. And I don't doubt that the European Union would be willing to be flexible as to countries like Bulgaria, trying to secure natural gas from Russia. But if it accelerates too much, that's really going to bring into question not only economic solidarity, that is to say, coordination on economic issues, but possibly the whole objective of supporting Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. I think overall, right now, people are still very pro-Ukraine, and I don't think that solidarity is really cracking that much. But the Russian strategy at this point is basically to try to apply as much economic pressure as possible in as short a time frame as possible to try to maximize their advantage at this juncture. Because right now is sort of the transition period between the time when Europe is utterly dependent on, Russian natural gas and the prospective future time period when they've successfully pivoted away from Russian natural gas. So this transition period here, where they're trying to move away but haven't been able to fully, that's the point of maximum advantage for Moscow, and they're trying to leverage that right now by cutting them off of natural gas at the doorstep of winter, which is, upon us basically. And it gets much colder in Europe. It gets pretty cold in Europe. So they do need that natural gas for heating as well as for manufacturing and other uses. Bulgaria defecting in this manner, so to speak, is a success for that strategy.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a big success, but it is a success. So whether that turns into dominoes falling or if this is just an isolated example remains to be seen.
Population of Bulgaria 2022 is 6.9 million.
Yeah, it's not much. It's a pretty small country still.
Mm-hmm. Directly south of Romania, north of Greece and Turkey.
Yeah, historically, Bulgaria has been pretty pro-Russia. There's a lot of similarities in terms of the culture and to a degree, even the language. I think I remember reading that there's a weird degree of mutual intelligibility between Bulgarian and Russian, although I could be mistaken. Maybe that's a good that's a good cue for the usual disclaimer. Uh, I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here, painfully apparent at times. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't want to make any more of an ass of myself than I already do. So please do contribute in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, 99% of the time anyway. So I won't see what you write immediately, but I will see it eventually.
And if you have any kind corrections or scathing reviews, don't hesitate to say so in chat or leave a YouTube comment.
Indeed. Please do.
I had like a breakthrough, I think it was like a year and a half ago, of regarding scathing comments, because there's like one particular hater on my YouTube channel who just keeps sticking around. He keeps making a comment. He's always got some issue he has with my videos. And for a while I was like, man, like it is just impossible to make this person happy with my videos. Then I was like, wait, every comment that I get bumps my video up based on the YouTube algorithm. This person is helping me. Okay, this is good. So whenever I see their comments, I'm like, yep, I know what you do. I know what your stance is going to be. I know that you need to be on your very, 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 very tall horse as you give me feedback and critique my content and that kind of a thing. But you're just giving me more power, so feel free to give me and Agent Smith a grumpy comment. We welcome those.
Well, when life gives you lemons, find a way to monetize them on your YouTube channel.
Yes. Or open a lemonade stand.
Let's see. We already talked about the offensive in Kherson last time. I don't think I have any updates on that.
Hmm.
Kharkiv, talked about that. The Russians did replace the deputy minister in charge of logistics. That was a four-star general named Dmitry Mulgakov. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. I apologize. They finally got rid of him. Given the state of Russian logistics, it's no mystery as to why they replaced him. Probably more a mystery why they didn't replace him sooner. So maybe Russian logistics will improve going forward. We'll see. I'm a little skeptical, but hey, hope springs eternal. If you're Russian, anyway. I thought this was an interesting story. It doesn't mean too much in the grand scheme of things, but have you ever heard of Lukoil?
Luke Oil?
Yeah, it's the Russian state-owned oil firm, or at
Oh,
least
no,
one of them.
I'm not.
Yeah, it's well, as I said, it's a state-owned enterprise, and it owns most of, or at least a lot of, Russia's oil assets. And the guy who had been chairman was a dude named Ravil Maganov. And he had actually gone so far after the invasion happened to criticize the invasion. He was actually relatively outspoken of this regard. Let's see if I can find it in my notes here. He called for the conflict to end as soon as possible, and he expressed his sympathy to the victims of what he described as a quote unquote tragedy.
Huh.
Pretty ballsy statement there for somebody on the inside of Russia's political establishment.
Hmm.
And I was kind of interested to see what might happen to him. He seemed to be doing okay, but well, you remember what happens, right, Neuro?
Accidents.
Accidents. You can probably guess what this one was, can't you?
He probably fell off of something or something really unlucky happened to him and he ceased to exist.
Really close. It's actually. Do you remember what happened to the doctors back during the pandemic?
Hmm. Did they have the bad tea or something else?
They kept falling out of windows.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Very clumsy people, Neuro. Well, as it happens, Mr. Maganov fell out of a sixth floor window at a hospital.
Wow. What are the
Hmm,
odds?
what are the odds? Apparently, he's been one of a string of people on the inside who have had accidents like that, or at least similar.
Hmm.
And let's see, there was a millionaire who had managed a company called Novatech, Sergei Protasinya. He was found alongside his wife and daughter at a Spanish villa in April. And then there was the vice president of Gazprom Bank, which I assume is the financial arm of Gazprom. His name was Vladislav Avayev. He was found dead with his wife and daughter in their Moscow flat, also in April. And then in May, another Lukoil guy, a tycoon named Alexander Subotin, died of heart failure, reportedly after seeking alternative treatment from a shaman.
Hmm.
Maybe that one wasn't assassination, but just death by superstition. But certainly some suspicious circumstances in the other ones,
Hmm.
up to and including Mr. Maganov here. So it seems that there's some dissent within the ranks of Russia's political establishment. So I thought it was worth mentioning these assassinations for that reason.
Hmm.
Whether or not that blows up into anything more significant than the odd outburst and corresponding assassination remains to be seen. Let's see, one of the last independent news outlets in Russia had its operating license revoked. That was Novaya Gazeta. So that's just part of a trend of independent outlets being shut down. No surprise there. But worth mentioning because it was probably the last big name of all of the independent outlets. I could be wrong on that. If we have anybody from Russia who knows better, please do let us know. Let's see, something else. Russia has been buying military hardware from North Korea in order to try to shore up its supplies, which are, of course, hurting. I've also read that they've been sort of scouring the earth for leftover Red Army surplus, a considerable amount of which was sold during the Cold War, but then also in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So all of that ammo and weapons and equipment that had been shipped off to Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, all of that now has a significant bidder trying to acquire it, that being Moscow. They want that ammo. They can't, well, they can probably make a lot of what they need, but they can't make enough, basically. So they're trying to buy it off of the global market. The Soviets did dump a considerable amount of weapons and ammunition on the global markets during the Cold War, so I don't doubt that there's a considerable surplus remaining. Whether or not they'll actually be able to get to it, or whether or not it'll still be of any use by the time they do get to it, debatable. That remains to be seen also. Now, let's see. We already talked about the referendum. Oh, yeah, I had another note on mobilization. So there was a rumor that I think is unconfirmed, but it suggests that the mobilization is intended to be completed by November the 10th. That's not going to happen. They'll have to cut a lot of corners to make that happen. But supposedly the target date is November the 10th. And also, this is the source that suggested the actual number that were going to be mobilized was 1.2 million rather than 300,000. So that's it for your Ukraine update for the week.
Appreciate that. Chad is asking if they missed discussion on the Italian election. No.
No,
That
haven't
was-
gotten to it yet.
That was mentioned before we started. We could talk about that next, potentially.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that. We've actually talked about it before. I don't
Hmm.
remember when. It was like a month or two ago, maybe, but I had brought up that there was a far right party that was doing very well and would probably get into power in the next election in Italy. So uh, news outlets are reporting it more widely now since the election. Wait, was it today? Was the election today or is it soon? I don't remember what it was exactly. Well, there's certainly been more reporting on it. Oh, yeah, it was today, exit polls. So we'll see how that turns out probably tomorrow. But yeah, the gist of it is that there's a party called the Brothers of Italy. It has its roots in Italy's far right. The current leader has tried to move away from the far right towards the center, so it's not as radical as it used to be. But the fact that there's a party of that kind that's this close to power at all is disconcerting for a lot of people who are more centrist and certainly people who are more leftist in their political orientation. A lot more people are turning towards the right and considering the Brothers of Italy, uh, where they previously had not considered them because there's sort of a disenchantment with pretty much all of the things. The economy, the politics, just everything just doesn't seem to be going very well in Italy and has been not going well for a considerable period of time now. So, the center left had also the center right for that matter had already discredited themselves years ago. They had a populist government that bizarrely combined a sort of populist left party with a populist right party in a single coalition. That didn't last very long, unsurprisingly. And after that coalition collapsed, the result was a impromptu coalition between the populist left party and a center left party, which I think was called Democratic something. It was led by a technocrat that had governed Italy for a while, a couple of years ago. So that coalition was in power, but it was technically not an elected government. It was just kind of something that came out of political maneuvering within the legislature. And some people were critical of it for that regard, but were otherwise willing to kind of tolerate them so that they could kind of navigate some of the difficult economic waters Italy's been in for the past few years for obvious reasons. But it was always kind of known that the conservatives kind of had the inside track on the next election, whenever that would be. In fact, I remember reading before the pandemic happened in 2020 that there would be another election before too long in Italy, and that the Liga, sort of the right-wing populist party, was expected to win that hands down. It was actually because they expected to win that they tried to force an election early, but that led to the surprise alliance between the populist left and the center left, so that kind of blew up in their face. But it seems that defeat was only temporary because now it's looking like Liga is going to be a part of the new right-wing coalition government that's shaping up. Although they're probably not going to be the biggest party. I think Brothers of Italy is expected to be the biggest party in the new coalition. But again, more people are willing to consider them just because, the populists and the establishment and just everybody and their mother has been in government basically at this point over the past 10, 20 years, and none of it has worked. So they're trying to find something new. And for a lot of people, that's the Brothers of Italy. So again, it's not a fascist party, but, fascists seem to like it. It has its roots in Italy's far right. So there's some concern about just what they'll do in government. Their leader, um, I won't comment on that, but their leader is a woman named Maloney. If I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And she has stated that she's not going to deviate too much from the status quo. So, on Ukraine, she said that she's pro-Ukraine, that she won't challenge the government's policy and trajectory on, supporting Ukraine, supporting NATO, etc. She has said that she's going to take a harder line on things like immigration and that she's going to try to have a stronger industrial policy that focuses more on economic development in Italy. But otherwise, as far as foreign policy in terms of security issues like Ukraine and whatnot and NATO, she says she's not really going to change anything there. So that's going to ease the minds of a lot of establishment people and voters. Whether or not she actually does that when in power, we'll see. I don't know that her coalition partners will necessarily let her do otherwise. They tend to be relatively more establishment aligned. So ideally, they'll keep a check, kind of keep them, that is to say, the Brothers of Italy in check once they're in. But all of that is an open question, and it's because it's an open question that you've been seeing Italy in the news more recently. It's basically a very similar situation to France, where they have Marine Le Pen and her party. What was her party called? I'm suddenly blanking out on what the party was. It's like the Front or something like that. Maybe chat can remember. But Marine Le Pen, it's very similar, similar populist right-wing party that has its roots in France's far right, but moved closer to the center to take advantage of the public's disenchantment with establishment center-left and center-right parties. Marine Le Pen was never able to win power, or at least she hasn't been able to win power yet. But it seems that Maloney is going to be able to do that. Oh, there we go. National Front, National Rally. Thank you. And somebody in chat got it. I knew somebody would know. But yeah, it's a question mark. Like I can't like tell you what exactly they're going to do. If I had to guess, I would say they're going to focus mostly on domestic political issues. And, maybe they could substantively implement economic reforms, but probably not. I mean, those reforms are always going to be unpopular. So probably they'll just try to spend money to kind of get people quiet, get them happy. And they'll probably pay for it by borrowing money, I would expect. They'll probably also spend money on industrial policy, but that's mixed success. Industrial policy has a mixed record of success. I don't know that Italy is going to be any more successful in that regard. Yeah, just a lot of distractions, most likely, is my expectations. The fundamental issues are security issues, immigration, and economic issues. But all of those would require significant changes that probably the new government is not going to have enough support for, or changes that will have relatively limited impact. In which case, they're not going to be that popular, certainly not in the medium to long run.
So it seems like a bit of a flavor change for Italy, but not really a major, clear overhaul of stuff, just because it takes a lot of bipartisan support to do that.
Yeah, that's kind of what happens when the politics in a country is in a place where there are no popular solutions to a pressing problem or a long-running problem. In order to really solve a long-running problem, you may have a set of solutions that would work, but which nobody wants. And the only solutions people do want are solutions that would not actually address the problem. So you end up in a kind of political limbo, generally for an extended period of time. And that's kind of how you get populist governments coming to power. The establishment parties can't really respond to that kind of pressure because they tend to be more technocratic. So, they'll do conventional things in response to problems, but frequently those either have effects that are very long term in outlook. They won't start really impacting until like 5, 10 years later, or alternatively, they have solutions they can implement, but which are very painful in the short term and hence are very unpopular. So then people vote in populists to do something different, to try to fix the problem without doing it in an unpopular way. And of course, that's impossible, given for in a lot of these issues. And so the populists generally just govern by distracting people with a lot of token bullshit. And that's pretty effective in the, I mean, that's what it is, right? I mean, they'll say that they're addressing the problem while taking measures that look like they're taking action, but in reality, the measures they're taking are superficial or theatrical in nature without substance or are not having any substantive effect in the short term or even any term, of time frame. And that works for a while until you get something like an actual substantive crisis that requires them to do a thing. And frequently, populists don't know how to do anything. They don't have the experience, or their only experience is just theatrics. And, theatrics isn't going to stop a invasion or a pandemic. So frequently, the mask is removed during those kinds of crises. And that's given, the crises that we've been experiencing with some regularity over the past few years, lots of populist governments have been struggling correspondingly. I don't doubt that Maloney will be similar in that regard if she does end up in power. I would welcome a surprise in that regard. Maybe she'll be very effective. Maybe she knows exactly what Italy needs, and then she's able to improve the economy and solve the immigration crisis, and is able to double down and help Ukraine in a substantive way, or any number of the other issues. Maybe she has real solutions. I'm skeptical. I'm a cynic at heart, I guess.
What is
But we'll
their
see.
immigration crisis?
Well, I mean, you're probably familiar with the immigration crisis in Europe, right? They've had all
Yeah.
the immigrants coming in from Syria, from sub-Saharan Africa,
Yeah.
coming in through places like Libya or Turkey.
Hmm.
And, that's affected all of Europe. But it's affected certain countries more than others, and Italy is one of those. And the reason Italy is disproportionately affected is because Italy is one of the countries people pass through on their way to other parts of Europe. It's basically the gateway, or one of the gateways into Europe that immigrants take.
Hmm.
And the result is that Italy has been disproportionately burdened by the number of immigrants slash refugees that have been coming into Italy, and which the Italian government has in turn been responsible for.
Hmm.
This is one of the reasons that coordination over the immigration issue within the European Union has been very difficult, because they actually had laws on the books before the immigration crisis that said that whenever refugees try to enter Europe, it was the responsibility of the government in control of the territory that they initially entered to take care of them. So you can see the problem, right?
Hmm.
There's only a few countries in which the vast majority of those immigrants will initially enter Europe. Greece, Italy, Spain, basically the countries that are the closest to other countries, through which the immigrants are coming into Italy, into Europe from. And so, because of that rule, then basically most of the burden of dealing with the influx of immigrants fell on just a handful of governments within the European Union. So, for those governments, the idea that they should be expected to handle all of these immigrants was ridiculous.
Hmm.
And they were very upset with other countries in the EU that were suggesting that they needed to handle it. So, the result of that later on was an agreement by which countries would share the burden. Some of those refugees slash immigrants that were being hosted by the gateway countries would be redistributed to other countries in the European Union, which sounded like a really good plan on paper. But in practice, it ran into a lot of opposition because there's a lot of countries in Europe that are pretty ethnically homogenous and do not have a lot of experience with large-scale immigration. And for those countries, there was a lot of resistance and skepticism about the prospect of taking in a large influx of foreigners, especially foreigners from outside of Europe. And there was also populism in Western Europe that kind of sprung up in response to that. It was already there, but it certainly flared after that proposal. And things have not really quieted down all that much in regard to the immigration issue ever since. Sweden just had an election where right-wing parties were able to win power, largely on the back of the immigration issue. I don't think it was by much. I think the margin of victory was very narrow, as I recall, but they were able, in the end, I think, last I read anyway, to eke out the victory. So immigration, very contentious in Europe, and efforts to try to address it in a way that is equitable, fair to the immigrants and refugees, and which also tries to relieve the burden on the gateway countries, as I'm calling them here. All of that has not really succeeded thus far. Solutions have been very mixed in their effectiveness, and there's no real consensus as of yet as to how to really deal with all of the immigration that has been coming into Europe over the past 10 years, with correspondingly deleterious effects on the stability of politics within individual European nations, Italy among them, which is why immigration is such a big issue there and why I call it the immigration crisis in Italy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, though. Countries that are geographically closer to mass exodus areas are going to have a lot more burden placed upon their own system of immigration in their country.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Greece has also kind of had to deal with that. A lot of Syrian refugees come through Turkey and then try to float basically over the Aegean Sea. I think it's the Aegean Sea. I'm going to go with the Aegean. Please correct me if I'm wrong. They try to float over the Aegean Sea over to Greece, and then Greece has to host them on, some islands. And so there's been reports that some of the people in boats have been turned away. There's been that, but also conditions in some of the camps at which they've been placed until they can be otherwise permanently settled have not been very good. And part of that is just because, lack of resources, but also because the Greek government doesn't really want to incentivize further immigration by having conditions be too good, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Italy has been particularly aggressive. There's been reports of them firing upon some of the people in the boats that are trying to float across the Mediterranean.
Whoa.
Some of that has been warning shots, but allegedly some of it has not been. Kind of depends on who you want to believe.
Mm-hmm.
Spain is interesting because they actually still have territory in Africa. Did you know that?
I did not know that. Where is it?
So if you look at Spain and you look at southern Spain, you can see there's like part of North Africa that kind of spikes up towards Spain.
Yeah.
It's actually really close to the Gibraltar territory that belongs to the UK. And so there's two little territories, I guess enclaves, of Spanish territory that are there in that area. It's sort of the very tip of northwestern North Africa. I think one of them is Melilla, and the other one is, I think, Ceuta or Ceuta. I don't know how to pronounce them. But they're very small territories, but the Spanish have retained them, and they're basically the last vestiges of Spain's empire in northwestern Africa. They never held a lot of territory there, but they did hold some. Most of it they ended up giving back to Morocco, but they held on to those two little enclaves. So the reason those enclaves are interesting is because those enclaves are sort of a point of entry for refugees/immigrants trying to get into Europe. They've got the whole area fenced off, but it's not uncommon for there to be groups of immigrants who basically storm those fences and try to climb them.
You said Melilla?
Yeah, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. It's like two L's. And I think
yeah.
Normally in Spanish, two L's is supposed to be pronounced as a Y.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there it is.
Yeah, Melilla. Autonomous city of Spain located in the north of Africa. Eastern side of the Cape of Three Forks, bordering Morocco and facing the Mediterranean Sea. An area of 12.3 kilometers squared. It was part of the province of Malaga until 1995, when the Statute of Autonomy of Melilla was passed, or Melilla. And then what was the other area you said?
Ceuta, Ceuta. I think that's what it is.
And it's where?
It's not too far from the other one, I don't think.
Ceuta.
Ceuta. I'm Googling it. Oh, yeah, I was right. Let me see where that is in relation to Melilla. Yeah, that's like way up at the north. That's like right next to Gibraltar.
Hmm.
Oh, wow.
Oh, yeah, I see
Okay.
that. Ceuta.
So they're nowhere near each other. I was wrong about that. I thought they were close, but I guess not.
Ceuta is a Spanish autonomous city on the north coast of Africa, bordered by Morocco. Lies on the boundary between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. Hotels. $64 a night.
Not bad.
Yeah.
But if you're an immigrant and you can scale the fence, then technically you're in Spain, and then you can presumably hop a ferry or something and
Uh-huh.
then get onto the mainland. And from there, you pretty much have free access to the Schengen zone.
Yeah, these dotted lines, I'm assuming, are ship routes.
Yeah.
So there's one from Ceuta to Algeciras in Spain, and then from Melilla, there are a whole bunch of different routes. Some of them are going to Almeria in Spain. Some of them are going to Montpellier. Montpellier in France. Cool. Yeah, so those are the hubs where you're saying a lot of immigrants will go from Africa and then try to spring into Europe.
Exactly.
Mm.
And it's actually had an impact on Spain's foreign policy
Mm-hmm.
because they were having trouble stemming the tide, so to speak. There were just waves of migrants coming in and basically just storming that fence. And the local authorities were having a lot of difficulty trying to detain them all, stop them, what have you. And so, what Spain ended up doing is signing an agreement with the government of Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the Moroccan government has basically agreed to try to arrest these people as they're traveling to those two territories, those two enclaves, in order to try to help Spain deal with that migration wave. And that's been pretty successful. There hasn't been nearly as many people trying to cross through that route
Mm-hmm.
since that agreement was signed. Now, the trouble with that agreement is that it gives Morocco leverage, sort of in the same way that Turkey has leverage because of its agreements over immigration with Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if Spain or Europe even does anything Morocco doesn't like, then they can just say, okay, well, we're not going to arrest these people anymore. And then you're back to square one, with the waves of migrants, storming the fences again.
Mm-hmm.
So there was some of that more recently when Algeria and Morocco were fighting a little bit, a little border clashing over occupied Western Sahara and the territory down south there. And Morocco didn't entirely appreciate the stance that Europe took on that, and so they started threatening to revise their agreement over immigration with Europe, whereupon the Spanish government entered negotiations and qualified some of its previous statements about the matter. So Morocco is kind of a hidden power there as far as immigration and the immigration crisis,
Mm-hmm.
just like Turkey is. You just don't hear about Morocco as much because, it's just a quieter country, basically. Turkey always has lots of drama. There's
Mm-hmm.
always something going on there. But Morocco, not so much. It's just a quiet little constitutional monarchy that minds its own business. Unless you're Western Sahara, in which case they very much do not mind their own business.
They keep to their sphere of influence and don't make too much noise.
Yeah. Here's some trivia for you, Neuro. The first country to recognize the independence of the United States was Morocco, if I'm not
Really?
mistaken. Yeah, I believe so.
Huh.
Unless my memory is making shit up again. Let me Google that. It was one of the first countries. Okay, not the first country.
What was the
They did open
first?
it very quickly. Opened its ports to American ships by decree in 1777. Formally recognized 1786. Oh, here you go. Morocco formally recognized the U.S. by signing a treaty of peace and friendship in 1786, a document that remains the longest unbroken relationship in U.S. history.
Hmm.
So we've been on pretty good terms with them for a long time.
Today I learned.
They were also relatively pro-Western during the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
And during the War on Terror, they were also relatively more aligned with us.
Why?
So, I mean, common interest. Terrorists are a bigger threat to regimes in the Middle East than they are to the West. So any help they can get in that regard is going to be appreciated.
Oh, true.
Yeah, Iran has the same problem, but we had other baggage, so we didn't really work with them as much.
Mm-hmm.
There were some countries like that we did not coordinate with. But Morocco was probably one of the more palatable ones, shall we say.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Iran, what were the protests about? I'm
Yeah.
guessing they're ongoing still. We haven't really covered that in great detail yet.
Yeah, that's still a thing. How does time fly so much when we do this? It's already been like 2 hours.
Yeah.
Doesn't feel like we've been talking that much. Yeah, Iran. So the deal there, I think it was a couple months ago. Let me check my notes. I want to try to, let's see. Yeah, August. Okay. So there were some new rules that were passed by the government in August. Some new restrictions, specifically regarding hijab. So for
Mm-hmm.
those of you who don't know what a hijab is, that's the covering that women wear in Iran to cover their hair. Um, so let's see. The restrictions involved the introduction of surveillance cameras to monitor and fine unveiled women, either that or refer them for quote unquote counseling. Uh, and then also a mandatory prison sentence for any Iranian who questioned or posted content against the hijab rules.
What?
Yeah.
Okay, that's crazy. I can see why people be pissed. Damn.
Yeah, so that was upsetting for people. And there was apparently a surge in, well, an uptick in arrests regarding enforcement of the new rules.
Mm-hmm.
And so that led to women in particular protesting, posting photos, videos, etc. So there was already some tension, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the real catalyst, which I think was just recently, it was just like a week or two ago, I don't remember exactly when, but there was a woman named Masa Amini. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing, I don't speak Farsi. Uh, but there was a woman named Masa Amini, and she was arrested. I think she was a protester. And she was like a lot of protesters lately. She took off her hijab. So she was arrested. And later on, she died in custody. And there was some question, of course, as to how she died in custody. So the immediate assumption on the part of protesters is that she was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And supposedly she was beaten. But we can't verify because the government has not allowed an independent autopsy.
Mm-hmm.
It has not revealed details about what happened to her. It hasn't even let her parents see her body since she died.
Mm-hmm.
So that, of course, just makes people even more suspicious. Now, the government says they've carried out an investigation and they say that it was an accident and that she had a pre-existing health condition that ended up spiraling while she was detained and that she died from that.
Hmm.
But then her father came out to media and said she had no pre-existing health conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently the government is lying its ass off and trying to cover up the fact that something happened. We don't really know exactly what.
Yeah, it sounds like another people falling out of windows routine.
Yeah, yeah, probably that's the case. So the fact that this woman was arrested, I think again for not wearing her hijab and then killed for it, was enough to set people off. Again, they were already kind of on a hair trigger because of the introduction of the new rules in August. Those were already very controversial, but this was basically the straw that broke the camel's back.
Hmm.
And since this woman's death, there have been significant protests in Iran,
Hmm.
and they've been proliferating pretty rapidly, relatively speaking. Initially, they were concentrated in the northwest of Iran. For those of you who don't know much about Iran, uh, Iran is only about 50% ethnically Persian. The rest of the population is a mix of a whole bunch of other ethnic groups. The two largest that I'm aware of the ethnic minorities in Iran are ethnic Kurds and ethnic Arabs. And I'm sure there's a bunch of others, but those are the two main ones I always remember. I believe those are the two largest. So northwestern Iran is majority ethnic Kurdish. That is where most of the Kurdish population is, and I believe that they're the majority there. And because this woman herself was Kurdish, and because the incident in question happened in that territory, that was the first place where the protests really took off.
Hmm.
Now, for a while, then, the protests were regionally concentrated, and it didn't necessarily look like they would spread too much beyond that. Uh, in the days subsequent, they have spread beyond, so it's kind of a moot point by now. But at first, they were concentrated there, and it's kind of branched out to other areas, not necessarily because people in other areas are sympathetic to Masa Amini, the woman who died, but because the protests are spiraling and encompassing other issues that were pre-existing in Iran. Obviously, economic conditions are not great in Iran. It's one of, if not the most heavily sanctioned country in the world, so their economy has really been tanking for a long time, and it's very difficult to find opportunities. So that's a big gripe for a lot of people against the government. They blame the government for not managing the economic crisis as well. Some people are upset with the government getting into adventures in the rest of the Middle East. They don't really see why they need to spend money to prop up the Syrian government or to help the Palestinians or to do whatever Iranian special forces are doing in Iraq. Like all of that seems like a waste of money to people who are really struggling.
Hmm.
So that's another issue. There's also some issues with climate. There's been issues with weather, not weather, but rain failing. So there's been shortages of water. There's one particularly large lake that was apparently, nearing expenditure, basically. And agricultural decline in general, there's just been issues with that. So there's just a lot of other issues that people have with the government. And so the protest was initially about Mesa Amini's death, but since then, people in other places have also been protesting, not just in solidarity with Miss Amini, but also to bring forth their own gripes against the government
Hmm.
and to try to pressure the government into giving concessions on those areas as well. So this thing is proliferating, basically. It's gone beyond just a protest about hijab, and it is becoming a protest about the government.
Hmm.
And it's specifically because of that fact that the hijab protesters may actually get their way here. Uh, from what I read, there are people within the Iranian government that are hardliners that just want to crack down. They've already done some of that. I think I read that something like over a dozen some people have been killed now by the government, and probably more. And that could easily be much higher if the government really wants to crack down. They've been going relatively easy on them lately.
Hmm.
But there are also dovish members of the regime. And these, mind you, are not doves per se. These are just relatively dovish people within the government. The government as a whole right now is fairly hawkish in outlook. But the doves within the regime right now, they're a little concerned that the government is going to crack down too hard here and instigate a bigger backlash later. You know, if you're an authoritarian, you don't necessarily have a problem with bloodshed. That's you're kind of used to and ready for the usage thereof. But you don't want to waste it either. Like if you use it too much, then invariably the people are going to turn on you and you're going to have bigger problems than just protests.
Hmm.
So you have to economize your bloodshed, basically, to use economic terminology. And the doves in the regime right now don't really think this is worth bloodshed. They don't think this is worth a major crackdown. So from their perspective, the reforms that the hijab protesters are asking for, which is just relatively mild, just don't kill people for not wearing hijab, don't harass people with morality police, that kind of stuff. That stuff is within the realm of possibility. The regime isn't going to like it, but I think the doves may have enough influence to actually swing it. And not because they want to, again, but because they see that as more uh, palatable rather, than using violence to crack down on this. They're more interested and more concerned about unrest over economic conditions, state violence, state repression, stuff like that. The bigger stuff. That's more what they would rather focus on, and that's more what they would rather preserve their political capital to deal with.
Hmm.
So there's a chance here that the government will actually implement some hijab reforms, and at that point, maybe crack down a little in order to try to tamp down the protests. What they really don't want is for the protests to keep proliferating and expand to other issues, whereupon the protesters start making other demands that probably involve some degree of regime change or political change that the government is not going to want to do.
Hmm.
So if they have to give up some hijab regulations in order to preserve the regime, they're going to do that. That's easy trade.
Hmm.
That's very cheap from their perspective. I don't imagine that would be tough for them. The only issue preventing them from doing that is going to be, again, the hardliners. There are always just bullheaded dumbasses in any government that refuse to make concessions. Like, just don't think they need to. They think they can fight their way out of anything. And invariably, they make trouble for everybody in doing so. So, whether that type of person within the political economy of Iran has more power, or if the more cautious members of the regime have more power, this is going to be a test of that question. We shall see. It's not something I can really predict right now. The regime's politics are very opaque. But it's going to be interesting to say the least, to see how they try to deal with this. If nothing else, they can play for time. Time is always your friend if you're an authoritarian government dealing with protesters, because sooner or later they have to go back to work, they have to go back to school. They've got other stuff to do, generally.
Hmm.
And it does cost time and money in order to propagate a protest movement over the long term. So probably they'll do low-level repression like what they've been doing, and then just try to draw it out as much as possible to try to wear out the protesters and try to see if they'll just quit eventually.
Hmm.
That's what they've done in the past. There's been intermittent protests in Iran over the past five some years over this, that, or the other issue, be it foreign policy, environmental, economy, like whatever. There's been protests over it, but generally they go away after a while. And that's probably what they're going to go for this time. So unless the protests reach critical mass and become outright national protests at the rural and urban level, all calling for significant changes, they're going to play it cool for the moment. After that, if things keep escalating, we'll see if the hardliners or the cautious people in government are in charge.
Hmm.
And at that point, we'll see whether or not there's going to be a massacre or not.
Sounds a little bit similar to the civil rights movement in the US, where you've got different groups who all have things that they want changed, and for them to push together gives them a lot more momentum than if any individual group was trying to push for something in particular. So, like women's
Probably.
rights and African Americans, like working together in the 60s and 70s and so on.
Yeah, it's pretty similar. But the difference is that we had an open political system.
Hmm.
A big part of the strategy involved in the civil rights movement was to try to appeal to people in the North, whom were generally relatively more liberal in outlook. And when I say liberal, I don't mean like left-wing liberal, like what Americans think, but classically liberal. More about equality, citizenship, etc. So they didn't see that in the South. They wanted to try to broadcast the message that the Southern state governments were repressive, that they were using violence to deny people their rights, and that it was the obligation of every American to try to fight to defend those rights. So that was a clear-cut political strategy. It was not just meant to put pressure on southern state governments. It was also an effort to try to enlist northern liberals into the cause and to try to pressure them into pushing the federal government to provide the civil rights protesters with support and also to push through the civil rights law, the Civil Rights Act, rather. That's what it was. So there was a lot of strategy involved with that beyond just, protesting. But in the case of Iran, they don't have an open political system. Like, it's not democratic or representative. So protesting in that case is not about some broader strategy to mobilize a section of the country against another or to play one group of insiders off against each another. This is purely about trying to corner the regime and force it to give concessions out of fear that the protest will spiral into unrest and maybe beyond that into a revolution. One of the downsides of running an authoritarian system is that your whole outlook on politics is defined by fear. An opaque political system is not only opaque to people outside the political system, it's actually also opaque to the people within the political system. Because people hold office not because of political institutions, mechanisms like elections and whatnot. They hold office because of connections. This person is my ally, he's backing me, I'm giving him something in return. That's how I keep my job, and that's how I stay safe. But that can change at any time. There's no reason they can't turn on you or that you can't turn on them. Alliances tend to be very fluid. We see that even in democratic countries with the constant churn and the coalitions between different politicians and different political groups. That same process happens within authoritarian political systems, but it happens within the regime and it's invisible and it's very, very high stakes. Because if you have a big rival, what better way to deal with them than just killing them? That's an easy layup. If you can kind of maneuver them into a position where you can have them arrested or disappeared or whatnot, that makes your life much, much easier because you don't have to worry about them planning or plotting or scheming behind your back somewhere. Loyalty is very, very important to authoritarians, something that is not only true in authoritarian governments, but authoritarians of any kind, anywhere. They obsess over loyalty because they need that more than anything, because they have no other mechanism by which to exercise power. Without that, they don't have the security they need to make bold moves with any confidence. So in a political system like Iran's, then, the only hope is that the protesters can present a sufficiently large and frightening united front that they can coerce by fear the government into giving them what they want. Whether or not that's feasible or not is an open question. We've been here before, right? The Green Revolution was 10 years ago or so. Mass protests after an election. People wanted change. They wanted a change in the government. They wanted a change in, day-to-day life, the morality police, like all of it. And in the end, the government just crushed it through violence. The IRGC was just kind of unleashed on them. They killed people in the street, shot them down, like it got ugly. Even some of the highest people in government who had been pro-government but were in the reformist faction of government, even those people ended up getting placed under house arrest and marginalized in Iran's politics. So if the government really wants to crack down, they can, and it'll probably be very effective. The government has more public legitimacy than other authoritarian governments because it does have a populist base of support within Iran that is inherently and intrinsically anti-Western and pro-Islamic in outlook, and they see the government embodying those ideals. So it's not just a coalition. That is to say, the government rules not just by a coalition of insiders, of economic elites, large landowners, clerics, what have you, but it also has, as part of that coalition, a small slice of the electorate. That is to say, the body politic, common people who genuinely like what the authoritarian government is doing in Iran and want them to keep doing it. So they're a little smarter in that regard, and that gives them relatively more flexibility. Those guys in the IRGC that, drive around on bikes in Tehran and, beat people and shoot people, those guys are not like elites. Those guys are not millionaires. They don't have, big villas in Europe or some shit. Those people are ideologues. They're Islamists. They want an Islamist country, and they want to prevent any kind of introduction of what they call West toxification. That was sort of the old term from the 70s for the influence of Western culture on Iran. That's the kind of stuff that they think about and worry about. And so they're very useful pawns then for the government because they are willing foot soldiers for the authoritarian system that the Iranian government depends on.
Hmm.
So those are all big disadvantages then for the protesters. They have to overcome not only the government but also the far right wing of their own people. The body politic itself is divided. Not everybody wants the protesters to win in Iran, and especially in rural Iran. There's plenty of people that don't want the government or don't want the government to go easy on the protesters. One of the surprising things about the current protests is that they actually have a rural component. Usually, when there's protests, they tend to be urban. Generally it's people with more liberal, open-minded sensibilities in cities, urbanites who tend to be more anti-government. So whenever you see protests in rural areas, that's especially interesting.
Hmm.
That's more of a threat to the government than the urban protests, because the rural folks are more their base of support. So the current protests actually did extend even initially in the early going in rural areas. And so that kind of says to me that the protests are not entirely liberal in outlook. It's not like the protests are uniformly anti-government. It's more like almost like anti-police, you might say, kind of like the 2020 protests we had in the United States. Like a lot of people may agree in principle with the hijab rules, but most of those people do not agree that women should be killed or hurt because they're in breach of them. That's itself another divide within the conservatives in Iran. So there's a good chunk of the protests in northwestern Iran where the protests initially started who probably think like that. And that's probably more the rural protesters. That's probably more their mindset, I would expect.
Hmm.
Now, again, since then, that point has become moot because now the protest is not just about the woman who died. It's also about all of the other things. Everybody has a reason to protest, and more of them are coming out to do so. So whether or not the Iranian government can find a way to staunch that peacefully rather, or whether they're going to have to resort to broad-scale violence, that's kind of what I'm asking right now and what I'm watching for.
Hmm.
If they can do it peacefully, that would be best for everybody. But a lot of protesters might be disappointed because that's probably not going to involve like broader concessions on every issue. It'll probably be specifically targeted on the hijab issue.
Hmm.
Now, if they go violent, that's different. I would expect the government to win in that case. And then they won't have to give any concessions. But there's also, anytime violence is used, there's always a non-zero probability that it blows up in your face and then people just turn on you and now you have an uprising.
Hmm.
So the government runs that risk every time they do that. It's not likely. I don't expect it to happen, but it's possible. And given that the protesters have a genuine point here, that there was probably excessive force used against a detainee, it might be more likely now than in previous cases. But that's speculation on my part. Regardless, this is basically the outline of the issue. It comes down to tension over restrictive new hijab rules that then set people up to be even more outraged over the probable murder of a young woman who had been arrested because of these new hijab rules,
Hmm.
or at least because she was protesting them, one or the other. So we'll see what happens. Interesting times.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I wish courage to the people of Iran. I know that a lot of times people are basically suffering through certain conditions and so on that are unpleasant, but they can endure them. And then there's this sort of kind of uh, big deal thing that happens that ignites a lot of those existing tensions and that kind of thing. So this seems like a straw that broke the camel's back sort of deal.
Mm-hmm. Could be. So let's see. Protests in Iran, protests in Russia. I didn't mention the border clashes on Russia's periphery. There's There were border clashes between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and then there were also border clashes between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. So Russia's near abroad, as they call it, continues to be the source of no small amount of drama. It's not just Ukraine. And it's not just recent. This is something that's kind of come to define the region over the past couple years. It had been pretty quiet. Places like Central Asia and the Caucasus, well, I should say the former Soviet parts of Central Asia and the Caucasus, had been relatively quiet for most of the past couple decades. But in the past couple years, they've turned into pretty happening places. Border clashes, mass unrest, governments changing. It's a kind of a change in pace for the region. Normally, Russia would be paying very close attention to changes like that, but obviously they're somewhat preoccupied. So there's some question as to whether or not there are not new opportunities, as you might call them, available to local states that previously had been sort of policed by Moscow in a way that kind of kept them from overreaching too much. So those conflicts are also something to keep an eye on. I don't think they're going to spin out anytime soon, but you never know.
Hmm.
Oh, and the Queen of England died.
Yeah, we mentioned that on the last one and how it's a tricky evaluation for certain countries of whether they want to still have the British monarch as the head of state, and it is a pretty symbolic thing, but she had a relatively low scandal reign as far as monarchs are concerned. We went over the various countries that do still have monarchs.
She was really cute when she was younger.
Always
back in the 50s. I was talking to my grandmother actually about her when she was younger, and my grandmother said it was kind of weird watching her funeral because my grandmother was actually saw her coronation on TV way back in the day. Kind of coming full circle in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I brought up the Queen of England because there was an interesting little phenomena in Hong Kong after the fact. Have you heard about this?
No.
Well, as you know, in Hong Kong, they've been having some issues between the people of Hong Kong and the Chinese government.
Mm-hmm.
I won't get into them again unless somebody wants me to. I think everybody is pretty familiar with them by now. But there's lots of people in Hong Kong that are upset with Beijing and that have been, in part, trying to voice that disposition in a way that will not get them arrested by the new government, as you might call it, in Hong Kong. And one of the most recent ways they've done so was to try to place flowers in front of the British Embassy in Hong Kong as a way of showing gratitude and affection for the recently passed Queen. And as it happens, so many people decided to do that that a line formed outside the British consulate that was 2 to 3 hours long. It was not a small line. It literally wound around the block. So nominally, that was a show of, again, affection, you might say, for the Queen, and a way of showing condolences to the British royal family. But it also had a political subtext within the context of Hong Kong politics. That, again, being an increasingly narrow range of opinions that can be safely voiced in public, and the desire for people to try to resist that in little ways here and there as best they can. And this was one of them. Or, put another way, it was basically Hong Kong's public's way of saying fuck you to Beijing. That's the short version. Well, one of the things China, well, that is to say the Chinese government, has tried to do since it regained control of Hong Kong in 1997 is that it has tried to create a connection between the people of Hong Kong and the mainland. But of course, a lot of Hong Kong's institutions were designed by the British, and so they were somewhat British in nature. So one of the things the Chinese government did is to have all of the post boxes in Hong Kong repainted. I don't remember what color they were. I think they were blue. And they had the British crest on them or something. And so the Chinese government had them all repainted. I think to red, Somebody in chat, please correct me on this. My memory isn't the best. But that was just one of the little ways and one of the many little things that the Chinese government did in order to try to, well, in this case, literally repaint Hong Kong's institutions in a way that would try to minimize the visibility of the British origins of a lot of Hong Kong's institutions. And as a result, protesters and dissidents in Hong Kong have partly expressed their dislike and dissatisfaction with the Chinese government by showing solidarity openly, loudly, and visibly with Britain, with the UK, in this, that, or the other way. Sometimes they march with British flags. Sometimes they advocate for Hong Kong being returned to the UK. That's especially dangerous. Just little things like that.
Mm.
And so this was another manifestation of that. It was another way of saying that this was a British colony and we think things were better when we were a British colony as opposed to a Chinese colony.
Mm-hmm.
So again, lots of symbolism here happening,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of cross-pollination between political issues, you might say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, instead of like signaling, I'm giving a family example here. Instead of a parent saying that they dislike one of their children, they could just really, really focus on how much they love the other one in front of the other one, which ends up making them feel worse. But it wasn't directly saying that we dislike you. It's just like, man, we really like the UK and what they're doing. And they're like, rah!
Exactly. Pretty crafty. We'll see
Mm-hmm.
if they get away with it. I think obviously it's been, some time, so there's not lines now, but the government did allow it. But I don't know if the government would allow it again, in the future if something similar happened. Oh, we didn't talk about Ethiopia. Did you know that the war started up again?
No. What's going on
Yeah,
there?
there. Well, as you may recall, there had been a truce, and that truce had lasted for some months. I think, well, the truce started in August. No, not August. It started early this year, basically, and it had been on running for 5 months. And I think I even mentioned it once when I was talking about Yemen. There's also an ongoing truce in Yemen. And so I was talking about how truces in Yemen and Ethiopia suggested that maybe these conflicts were coming to a close. And well, some months later, not the case. Yemen's truce is still standing, but Ethiopia's truce has collapsed. And so now there's a new offensive by the government into the Tigrayan territory that is trying to separate. Interestingly, they have done so with the help of the Eritreans. The Eritrean government has also launched an offensive into Tigray territory.
Hmm.
And so it is, in that sense, a two-pronged offensive, probably from north and southeast, I would guess. And the Tigrayans are probably going to struggle to kind of fend that off. They're pretty good fighters. They've lasted this long, but I don't think they'll be able to hold out against that kind of combined pressure. We'll see. But it's unfortunate because there had been hope that maybe the conflict could be resolved peacefully, especially after 5 months of truce. But it seems that all parties involved were just using the time to rearm and prepare for the newest phase of fighting.
Yeah, we've talked about Eritrea and Agent Smith discussions before. It's not the most well-known country for Westerners and so on. It's kind of a hermit kingdom, so they're out of the news a lot of the time, but it's very closed, almost like a North Korea. And they have a dictator, yeah?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Unfortunately, so he was the leader of a separatist movement. Eritrea had been a province of Ethiopia for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
but they chafed under the Ethiopian government's control. They wanted to be independent, especially after the communists seized power in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And over the result of the subsequent civil war, they were able to gain increasing control over the territory of Eritrea. And upon the Civil War's conclusion, in the late 80s, early 90s, whenever it was, Eritrea was able to successfully peel itself off from Ethiopia and become an independent country.
Hmm.
And relations between Eritrea and Ethiopia have not been great ever since. There was a subsequent effort to fight over a border town that was in disputed territory in the mid-late 90s. The war didn't last very long, but it was enough to maintain a kind of Cold War state of affairs between Ethiopia and Eritrea. They were never able to quite negotiate a final border settlement over just where the border was. And as a result, both sides were kind of always prepared for a potential resumption of conflict. It was kind of stupid. The territory they were fighting over was basically desert, and the village they were fighting over was very small. There was one commentator who joked that it was like two bald men fighting over a comb. Such was his disdain for the conflict. But you know how it is with nationalists. It doesn't matter how worthless the territory is. It's their territory, and they have to fight for it to the death. So it goes. But anyway, Eritrea's government is led by the party, well, I should say maybe the militia or the revolutionary group that fought for independence over the course of the 1970s and 80s. That obviously won power very quickly after independence. But then, rather than setting up a democratic state, they set up a authoritarian one-party state. And the way the party is structured, it's basically just dominated by the one dude. I don't remember his name, but he is effectively the one-man dictator of Eritrea. And the authoritarianism there is very strict. As Neuro mentioned, it's kind of known as the Hermit Kingdom, or at least East Africa's equivalent. They don't allow very much exchange. Well, they don't allow much exchange of ideas or trade or what have you with the rest of the world. It's pretty closed off. And the government requires, what was it? Conscription. They have mandatory military service, but if you do end up getting drafted, the term of service is something like 30 years. It's
Wow,
not
that's
like,
really long.
yeah, it's not like you're in for a year or two, get some basic training and then you get pushed back into the civilian sector. If they do draft you, then you're basically the government slave for decades, and there's not really anything you can do about it. And it's actually because of that there were so many Eritrean refugees during the European immigration crisis. Everybody knows about the Syrian refugees, right? And some of the sub-Saharan refugees, but another major source was Eritrea, and that was because of people trying to escape that 30-year mandatory military service.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they kind of run it like Sparta. It's very militaristic. The party is very militarized. That's partly a legacy of their, origins as a revolutionary group. But they never really evolved beyond that. They really never learned some of the nuances of civilian governance. They try to run everything like it's a campaign.
Mm-hmm.
It's very top-down, very hierarchical. And they've used the border tension with Ethiopia to great effect in order to try to rationalize a continuation of what is, in effect, de facto martial law. The point is not really lost on anybody that that's kind of an artifice used to maintain power, but there's not much anybody can do about it either. Well, fortunately, the prime minister who came to power in Ethiopia a few, well, what, 5, 6 years ago, whenever it was, a guy named Abiy, was pretty interested in trying to resolve tensions with Eritrea. And they were actually able to come to an agreement by which they settled the outstanding border issue, and they actually signed a peace treaty. And that normalized relations. And that achievement actually resulted in Abe and the president of Eritrea receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. And that gave a lot of people optimism that Prime Minister Abe would be able to not only reform Ethiopia and modernize it, but also reform, change, and modernize the Horn of Africa as a whole, by sort of transforming the region into a more stable, prosperous version of itself. Unfortunately, that didn't pan out. And it's kind of a small, well, maybe not a small, it's kind of a tragedy. There was a lot of high hopes, but a number of factors conspired against him. And, maybe I'm being too nice. Maybe he played a role in that too. One of the criticisms against Abe is that he's autocratic, that he tries to centralize too much power in himself and his office, and that he was too domineering towards minorities, basically the minority ethnic groups and their respective political parties as represented within the governing coalition. But, that's all debatable. Regardless, the Horn of Africa has turned into something of a mess over the past 10 years. It had already been not doing great. I think everybody's pretty familiar with the anarchy in Somalia that's existed for the past 30 years. So Ethiopia descending into civil war has not really improved things, obviously.
Hmm.
Anyway, long story short, the Tigrayans are led by a guy who had been the leader of Ethiopia. He had been president. And over time, he struggled to maintain ethnic unity in Ethiopia. There were a number of ethnic groups, not least of which was the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia by population, which were slowly turning on the government. They felt that they were not being given enough discretion and autonomy within the government, and that the government was unfairly favoring the ethnic group of the president, which was, of course, Tigrayan. So protests happened, the government lost popularity, and eventually there was a power struggle within the party that resulted in the president losing power and Abe coming to power. So the former president of Tigray retreated to Tigray province and basically just resigned himself to leading his faction of the party in power in Tigray. So that worked for a while, but it seems he never really gave up his ambition of leading the country again. He butted heads with Abe on any number of reforms. And eventually, COVID-19 kind of gave him an easy out, right? So COVID-19 resulted in the Ethiopian government delaying national elections by a year. And the former president of Ethiopia, I don't remember his name. I think his name is Gabra Michael, but I could be wrong. But the former president and current leader of the Tigrayans argued that this was just fake. It was an attempt to preserve power on the part of Abe and to turn Ethiopia into his personal fiefdom. Now, whether you believe that or not, I leave up to you to decide. I'm not going to get into an argument with a bunch of Ethiopians. They argue about it quite a bit. Regardless, the people of Tigray tended to follow their leader on this one. And so the result was growing tension between the central government of Ethiopia and the provincial government of Tigray. And eventually, the Tigrayan militia made a move on a national military base located in their territory. And that resulted in a crackdown on the part of the Ethiopian government, which mobilized the army and sent it into Tigray. And that's when the war started in earnest. And at first, the Ethiopian government overran Tigray province, with help from the Eritreans, I might add. But eventually, the Tigrayans were able to rally. Gabra Michael was a veteran of the wars of independence in the 70s and 80s. He knew what he was doing. And he's apparently pretty well respected, not only in Ethiopia, but also amongst military analysts. They apparently consider him a very effective commander, tactically and strategically. So he was able to retreat into the countryside, reform the militia into a group of resistance fighters, guerrilla fighters, basically. And he was able to push out the Ethiopian army and retake control of the province, which is a pretty impressive feat. And after that, he was able to not only push out the Ethiopians, but also push out the Eritrean army and also push out state militia that had been deployed from the state south of Tigray, Amhara. So he basically just fought everybody and won. It's like a Hong Kong movie, right? Just the hero fights everybody and just destroys all of them. Mm-hmm. And after that, he actually went a step further and launched an offensive that was targeted at the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. And it was looking like he might actually take it. He was making a lot of progress until he stalled out. And it's not entirely clear what happened, whether he was checked in a military battle or if maybe he just overran his logistical supply chain, probably the latter. But after that, there were negotiations between the Ethiopian government and the Tigrayans, and the result eventually was a ceasefire. And at that point, the Tigrayans retreated back to Tigray, and the Ethiopian government started focusing on unrest in other parts of the country. It was not only the Tigrayans that had been unhappy with the government, and a number of other ethnic militias had been trying to rise up, or if not rise up, at least commit acts of terrorism against rival ethnic groups. So both of them retreated to their respective corners, and it was hoped they would negotiate a peace deal, but not the case. So now fighting has resumed. The Ethiopian army has been reconstituted, and with their Eritrean allies, They are now trying again to reconquer the province of Tigray. So stay tuned for the next episode. We'll see what happens. It's not entirely clear. They just started fighting again a few weeks ago. Well, let's see. Well, was there anything in particular else you wanted to get to?
Hmm. Don't have anything that's jumping out at me. We have about 15 minutes left.
15 minutes.
Yes.
Okay. Now, let me see. What else did I have here? See, the Ebola outbreak in Ghana was finally contained. It was declared ended recently. That's good news. Oh yeah. Did you hear about the tax cuts in the UK?
No.
Yeah, that's a big new thing they're doing. So it wasn't clear just what Liz Truss was going to do once she kind of got settled in, but it looks like her solution to some of UK's problems is large-scale tax cuts, which they're going to try to implement pretty soon here. It's an interesting move. I don't know that it makes, well, sense. I'm not sure what they're going for here. I guess I can't blame her. Part of what was able, well, part of the way that she was able to win her competition with Rishi for control of the Conservative Party in the UK was by promising tax cuts. So this isn't necessarily a public policy decision. This is probably more of a reward for people who supported her in that vote for power. And that would make a lot more sense to me than in terms of public policy, because this is weirdly pro-cyclical here. Like, there's already problems with inflation in the UK, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the economy is not, it's not growing very much, but it's not really in recession yet either. So if that's the case, why would you pour more money on the fire, right? Large-scale tax cuts are inflationary, right? You're putting more money into the economy. And that's not going to help you if you're kind of under the specter, living under the specter of an inflationary spiral. So it's pretty questionable on those grounds alone. But there's also the fact that interest rates are rising. So that's also going to kind of complicate things. If you're presumably they're going to pay for these tax cuts by borrowing money, right? I haven't heard anything about cutting spending, to correspond with these tax cuts. So presumably they're going to cover the shortfall in revenue by borrowing more money. But if you're doing that in an era where interest rates are rising, for the first time in a very, very long time, you're kind of taking a risk. It's if interest rates keep going up, servicing all that new debt is going to be very, very expensive, much later on when you're having to pay it back. I would point out that while tax cuts can goose an economy, they can inculcate economic growth and instigate innovation and business formation and what have you. If you're doing it for fiscal reasons, you have to do it while also cutting spending, because otherwise you're not actually cutting taxes. It sounds good as a headline, government cuts taxes across the board, in this, that, or the other area by this, that, or the other margin. But if you're not also cutting spending, then all you've done is defer those taxes to later, into the future, because eventually you will have to pay for that.
Yeah,
So that's
short-term relief, but you're increasing the weight of the costs later on.
Yeah. So effectively, that's what the government is doing. They're actually spending more money here. They're not spending it now, but they're spending it later. Although the effect will be immediate. Tax cuts will result in more consumption, more spending, etc. So that could be good for growth if it instigates, real substantive productivity-driven growth and innovation and investment. But successive British governments now have really struggled to do that, and I don't know that this is going to change that. So I'm a little pessimistic here that the British economy is necessarily going to benefit a whole lot from this move.
Well, yeah, I feel like saying that you're cutting taxes wins points with a lot of normal people. Like people
Yeah.
who don't understand how economies can grow or shrink or whatever. That's just like bottom line is I pay less this year or the next tax cycle or whatever whenever it goes through. So that's a way I think of scoring some early points, and then they can after the fact be like, all right, how do we how do we actually make this work and not have it come bite us in the butt later?
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm a little concerned with. I'm not sure they can manage this because in the article I read, they suggested that in a few years, they could have to borrow as much as 150 billion pounds a year to cover the deficit.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's not a lot if you're American. That's like the budget for the toilets at the Pentagon or some shit. But if you're a smaller country, you do have to actually watch how you spend money.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have Pentagon scale budgets in smaller countries. And 150 bill for the UK, that's a heavy lift. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And they're going to have to pay for that at relatively high interest rates. So the only way this kind of really makes sense is if the British economy grows enough to generate new tax revenue to make up the deficit. That could work. But again, like I said, this is something the British government has been trying for successful administrations unsuccessfully. They've tried tax cuts, they've tried industrial policy, they tried Brexit, God help them. Nothing has really worked. So I'm not entirely optimistic that this is going to change. This isn't going to be the thing that was the missing link that they needed all along and that is going to generate all this new economic growth.
Mm-hmm.
More than anything, if they really want to generate economic growth, genuine productivity driven growth, they're probably going to have to do deregulation. But that's exactly the kind of thing that is going to be immensely unpopular, especially in a country like Britain, where they've historically had quite a bit of regulation. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of it popular, some of it not popular. I'm sure they could probably trim some without too much problem, but probably there's going to be a lot of issues.
And then by lowering regulation, that would incentivize businesses to move to Britain and it would give them more freedom to do whatever they want.
Yes, it would do that, but it would also allow businesses already in Britain to become more profitable, to cut costs more easily, and to otherwise face fewer bureaucratic hurdles in their business operations. You know, paperwork, little regulations here and there, it can be death by a thousand cuts if you're a business. So if you can reduce those, then you're reducing costs. And lower costs means more profits, which means more businesses are created, more entrance into the market in order to take advantage of the profits. And then you get more jobs, and then you get more income, national income aggregated. And then presumably you get more consumption, which then creates a virtuous cycle. People spend more, people then make more to meet the demand, and then so forth. So it definitely does work, but it comes at a cost. There is a trade-off there. Presumably the regulations were implemented for a reason. So whatever that reason is going to be the cost that you have to pay. More risk somewhere to someone.
What would be a way for them to cut spending?
The national government?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So for that, if you want to cut spending, the biggest spending items in the budget are not too dissimilar from the US. The military and the NHS. But we don't have an equivalent to the NHS, but we do have government support to healthcare spending, in the form of Medicare, Medicaid. So
NHS is National Health Service.
yeah, yeah, that's their healthcare provider. They're a single payer healthcare provider over there.
Oh.
So that's very expensive, right? Medical expenditures are going to be very high, especially in a developed country.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very large industry there that they effectively nationalized, or at least broad swaths of it were nationalized. So on the one hand, they're able to manage that such that it's very easy for people to get care and very cheaply. But they did that by pushing the cost away from consumers onto the government.
Mm-hmm.
And so the government has to get that revenue from somewhere. If consumers aren't paying for it themselves, the government has to tax it from other areas. So that makes up a big chunk of the budget. So the NHS, the military, and probably a lot of welfare schemes of one kind or another, basically their equivalent of Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
Transfer payments, let's call it that. That's a nice aggregate term that encompasses all of them. So those are some obvious areas if you need to make large cuts. But those are also areas where large cuts are going to be the most controversial. Like nobody wants to be the politician that advocates for throwing people out of hospitals, and closing them down. Nobody wants to be the guy that cuts, pensions to the retired. And probably there's some people that want to be the guy that cut the military budget, but there's always a big outcry against that as well.
Mm-hmm.
So those are not easy changes to make. Generally it's easier to make mild changes at the periphery of those things. Like you won't have significant cuts to a pension, but maybe you kind of jury rig the calculation for the payments so that it changes over time in a way that it becomes cheaper for the government over time.
Mm-hmm.
Little technical fixes like that are not obvious cuts generally are the ways that governments kind of fix problems like this without upsetting the public.
Mm-hmm.
But those are generally pretty small potatoes. If you need to make big cuts, there's no substitute for just outright downsizing the scale of the welfare state.
Mm-hmm.
And Britain and a lot of other countries in Europe, for that matter, are kind of getting closer and closer to a point, a threshold, beyond which they won't be able to avoid that. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure European politics will be very, very colorful beyond that threshold.
Yeah, for sure. Because once you have that safety net for yourself, basically, of affordable healthcare, and then that is taken away, that's a sudden new expense for people. Kind of looking at
Yeah.
what I pay for healthcare, and for me, it just seems absurd. And then you've got people who have long-term conditions that they need regular care and support for, and those can be super expensive too. So the welfare state and the medical support that they get is really nice, but it's also really expensive because you have to pay for it somewhere. So it's paid for in different ways. Like they just have higher taxes overall, and that's a big part of what it costs to run their government and that kind of a thing. But yeah, definitely unpopular whenever you are cutting spending, which means you're taking something away from someone, and they will pretty much always get upset by that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of challenge that the British government is going to face.
Mm-hmm.
If the economy does not grow its way, does not grow sufficiently to pay for these tax cuts,
Mm-hmm.
the British government is going to be facing a difficult challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So that's some interesting drama. I would not say it's the best start for Liz Truss. I was kind of hoping for something more insightful, more visionary,
Mm-hmm.
rather than a political move. But I guess that's what we have.
Gonna open with the standard political move here. Let's see what it does. Just go with the old trusty moves in the playbook. Not necessarily the good moves, but the old moves.
Yep.
Well,
Say
cool.
la vie.
Appreciate you helping break down everything for us. We had a nice discussion on the Russia-Ukraine situation, the protests in Iran. We touched on China a bit, learned about Ethiopia, and visited Britain with their continuous Brexiting once again. Appreciate your expertise as always, and thank you, chat, for joining in the conversation. I'll try to push this VOD live pretty quick here so you can read the chat. And if you missed any or all of this discussion, it will be on YouTube very soon. I'll update it, or I'll upload it here pretty soon.
Yep. No, thank you very much for having me on. Always a privilege.
Heck yeah. Just a quick calendar thing. I should be good for Agent Smith next week, but the weekend after that, I will be away for TwitchCon.
Gotcha. Yeah, no problem.
I give you your normal 20-minute walk challenge for the week, and hope you take care of yourself, sir.
Yep, will do.
See you on the
Talk
next
to you next
episode
time.
of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. See you next time.
GG. Nice. Thank you, chat, for hanging out. And we will push this to YouTube. Hello, YouTube. And hello, people in the comments. Feel free to leave us a scathing review.